Hi. In today's class, we're going to learn how to calculate a semi-variable cost in a flexible budget. So let's look at this problem. Now, in this problem, they've given us three different kinds of expenses: employee salaries, indirect repair materials, and miscellaneous cost. Now, we have to first identify which is a semi-variable cost. Now, we need to remember the rules for variable and fixed costs for this. In case of fixed costs, the amount remains the same irrespective of the units or hours of production. In case of variable cost, the cost per unit will remain the same irrespective of the units or hours of production. Now let's check which is a semi-variable cost, which is a fixed cost, and which is a variable cost. The first one, we have employee salaries. If you notice, under both 6,000 labor hours and 9,000 labor hours, the employee salaries have remained the same at 30,000 rupees. So we can easily mention that employee salary is a fixed expense. Let's move on to the next one, indirect repair materials. Now, indirect repair materials, the amount is not the same in both the columns. So it's definitely not a fixed cost. Now we need to check if it is a variable cost. If it's a variable cost, the cost per unit or cost per labor hour will remain the same. For that, let's find out what is the cost per labor hour. For the first column, the amount 40,200 divided by 6,000 hours will give us a cost per unit of 6.7. And for the second column, the amount 60,300 divided by 9,000 hours will give us the cost per unit. Now, if you notice, both the costs per unit are the same for indirect repair materials. So we can easily say that indirect repair materials are a variable expense. So now that we've identified fixed and variable, let's find out if miscellaneous comes under either of these two categories. The amount is not the same in both the columns, so it's obvious that it is not a fixed cost. What about the cost per unit? Let's find out that. So miscellaneous cost in the first column, 13,200 divided by 6,000 labor hours is giving me a cost per unit of 2.2. In case of 9,000 hours, 16,800 divided by 9,000 will give me 1.86. So clearly the costs per unit are not the same. So for an expense, if both the amounts and the cost per unit is not the same, then it becomes a semi-variable expense. So I'm going to write miscellaneous expense as a semi-variable expense. So if we have to prepare a flexible budget, say for example, in the question, they've asked us to prepare flexible budget at 7,000 hours. So I'm just going to prepare a column for 7,000 hours. Now we clearly know which is a fixed and which is a variable expense. So I'm going to mention under variable expense, indirect repair materials, and the variable cost per unit. How much was that? 40,200 divided by 6,000. So it remained the same at 6.7 for both. So we can mention 6.7 per unit. Now I'm going to multiply this into the respective hours. 6,000 hours into 6.7. So we already know these values. For the new column, for 7,000 hours, it will be 7,000 into 6.7. Okay. So we are going to be preparing a flexible budget at 7,000 hours. For 6,000 and 9,000 hours, the amount was already mentioned in the question. So I write it as it is. This is my variable expense. Moving on to the fixed expense. For fixed expense, we know the amount remains the same irrespective of the units or hours of production. My fixed expense over here is employee salaries, and it's going to be 30,000 in all my columns. The amount remains the same. Now, moving on to our semi-variable expense. We found out that miscellaneous cost is a semi-variable expense. Now, our semi-variable expense will be divided into two parts, variable and fixed. Now, we need to find out how much is variable and how much is fixed. In case of a semi-variable expense, we'll need a small working note. So let's look at this part of the Excel sheet. You need to first calculate the variable cost per unit in case of a semi-variable expense. The formula to find out the variable cost per unit is change in amount divided by change in units or hours. Now they have given us two columns information over here, and that's how we will be able to calculate the variable cost per unit. So variable cost per unit is equal to change in amount. Over here, miscellaneous expense is a semi-variable expense. Change in amount will be 16,800 minus 13,200. That divided by change in units or hours. In this case, 9,000 and 6,000 are the hours. 9,000 minus 6,000. Okay. So I have my change in amount and change in units. So 16,800 minus 13,200 gives me 3,600. And this divided by 9,000 minus 6,000 gives me 3,000. Now my variable cost per unit will be 3,600 divided by 3,000. This becomes the variable cost per unit, 1.2. Now I can use this to find out the variable portion of all my units of production, or in this case, hours of production. So I'm going to take this 1.2 and write it next to the variable portion of my miscellaneous cost. 1.2 per unit. So once you've calculated your variable cost per unit, multiply that into the respective hours. So for the first column, it will be 6,000 into 1.2. Second column, 9,000 into 1.2. And third column, 7,000 into 1.2. So with this, we have the variable portion of the semi-variable cost. Now, coming to the fixed portion. This is very simple. You already have the total cost in case of 6,000 hours and 9,000 hours. Out of the total cost, variable is already calculated. So the remaining automatically becomes the fixed cost. That means the total 13,200 semi-variable cost of 6,000 hours minus variable portion 7,200 will give me a fixed portion of 6,000. And this should be the same even in the other column, the 9,000 hours. So here the total is 16,800 minus variable portion is 10,800. Remaining becomes fixed. So you notice the fixed amount remains the same irrespective of the number of hours or units of production. Therefore, even for the column where they've asked us to prepare flexible budget, the fixed portion will remain at 6,000. So this is how you calculate the fixed and variable proportion of a semi-variable expense. And at the end of it, you just have to find the total to complete your flexible budget. Thank you.